Buffett Institute was created in 2015 to foster research and discussion of pressing global issues, and so the chance to join with our colleagues for today's discussion is really perfect for our mission. U.S.-Japan relations are being affected by all kinds of things that are going on right now. A rising China that is run, we learn, by a increasingly secure leadership, by our own unpredictable president and administration, and we never know what he's up to. But certainly one of the important things that he decided was to abandon TPP, and by a nuclear North Korea, which has its own unpredictable leader. And yet, it remains the case that Japan is the world's third largest national economy, and it remains a stalwart U.S. ally in that part of the world. But change is certainly afoot. And so one of the things that we're going to be able to do is think through and discuss some of what may happen. So just to tell you about the organization of today's event, we have two panels. The first one, which is assembled here to my left, is going to start on the topic of Japan's security challenges. And we've got three speakers and two commentators, respondents, discussants. And once they're done, then we are going to open the floor for audience Q&A. And at that point, I will MC that. And so I'll ask you to just raise your hand, and I'll call upon people in the order in which I see you. But we're going to start with Richard Bush, who's the Senior Fellow and Gu Chair in Taiwan Studies at the Brookings Institution. And then we will go to Jung Pak, who's the Senior Fellow and SK Korea Foundation Chair in Korean Studies at the Brookings Institution. And then our third presenter is Yuki Tatsumi, who's the Director of the Japan Program and Senior Associate of the East Asia Program at the Stimson Center. We will also have two discussants from Northwestern University, Katrine Katz, who's affiliated with our Political Science Department, and then finally, at the very end of the table, Dan Kirkmarek, who's Assistant Professor of Political Science here at Northwestern. So I'm just going to ask our panelists to make their presentations. They've got a pretty brief window, and so we'll move things along smartly, and then we'll go to our Q&A with the audience. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel.
Thank you very much, Bruce, and to the Buffett Institute for welcoming us here, and your desire to do this program with us. It's a good opportunity for us, and it's a good time to be out of Washington. Actually, I was born in Chicago at a hospital south of here that no longer exists, so it's nice to be home. I've given myself an impossible task, which is try to explain China's current external behavior in 10 minutes. Now, China is certainly engaged in an array of activities which, taken together, cry out for some sort of explanation. It's on track to become the world's largest economy. It's equipping an army, navy, air force, and rocket forces at a rapid rate. It has mounted intensive infrastructure building efforts around the world. Within East Asia, China has engaged in intimidation and coercion against Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines. It has built artificial islands in the South China Sea and is now creating a military infrastructure on those islands. All of this has set off a flurry of debate about what's going on here, what's the explanation for this activity. Some assert that Beijing is implementing a 50-year plan to become the dominant power in East Asia. Others argue that China is currently doing what any rising power would do, like the United States. Still others think that what China is doing is a legitimate response to the dominance of the United States. The Trump administration's view is pretty clear-cut. In its recently released national security strategy, it says China is a revisionist power intent on displacing the United States from East Asia, close quotes. Now, clearly how the United States, Japan, other Asian countries respond to this starts with our understanding of their intentions. If we do the analysis of intentions wrong, we're probably going to get the response wrong. Now, I can't sort of do an in-depth answer to this question of what is China up to, but I will offer a sensible, what I think is a sensible explanation. My premise is that as China revives itself as a great power, it will first seek to dominate the neighborhood it lives in before moving outward. Second is that it will continue to work hard to build up its domestic strength and reform itself internally. Now, my explanation for what China is up to stems from what one might call strategic geography. And to illustrate my point, I have two slides for you. And I'd ask you to imagine that Xi Jinping, the president of China, is actually Superman in disguise. And as Superman, he can fly high up into the sky, well above China, and he can see a long, long distance. He can use his X-ray vision to see through the clouds and the pollution. And if he looked to the east, this is what he would see. And it's the Japanese archipelago, the Korean Peninsula, and Taiwan. Japan has been a treaty ally of the United States for over 60 years. Korea has been a treaty ally of the United States for over 60 years. Taiwan was a treaty ally for a long time. And we still have a close security relationship with the island. If Xi Jinping, aka Superman, were to look to his south, this is what he would see. There's Taiwan again, but there's the Philippines, treaty ally of the United States, Australia, treaty ally of the United States, and then Vietnam, which used to be close to China, but over the past 3 decades, has moved away from China and towards the United States. So if the leaders of China feel a little bit encircled by the United States, they have some reason to think that. Now, the line of islands that runs from Japan through Okinawa, Taiwan, the Philippines, and down to Australia is known as the, quote, first island chain, and we might as well include South Korea in that, even though it's not an island. The second island chain runs through the Mariana Islands, down from Japan, including the American territory of Guam. The third island chain runs from the Aleutian Islands through Hawaii. These island chains form the strategic geography of the Pacific for over a century and help explain what the U.S. has been doing since World War II. During World War II, we basically had to fight our way across the Pacific after Pearl Harbor. First in the first island chain, and then in New Guinea and the Philippines. We skipped Taiwan, Okinawa, and we were getting ready to invade Japan when the atomic bombs were dropped. And the question that faced Washington after the end of the war was, having expended so much blood and treasure to gain control of this territory, should we give it up? As you can guess, the answer was no, or rather, hell no. U.S. leaders decided that the best way to protect the American homeland looking west was to deploy our forces all the way to the first island chain, and we have been there ever since. There are other reasons why we are out there. The fear of North Korean invasion of South Korea. We thought that being allied with Japan made good sense. There are some others, but we decided that for our own national security, it was good to be forward deployed. And I would make the argument that the fact that we've been there for so long has been good for East Asia as well, including China. Now, our being forward deployed creates a problem for China. For too long, Chinese leaders have had to contemplate defending their country at the coast. No country would want to have to do that. Remember what happened to us in the War of 1812. And so that is one of the motivations that has led them to build up Navy, Air Force, and rocket forces. They want to extend their strategic depth out into the East China Sea, the South China Sea, out to the first island chain. The problem, of course, is that we're already there, and we patrol in the air, on the water, under the water every day. Japan is there, and they patrol by air, by sea, and under the sea every day. So inevitably, we're going to, metaphorically at least, bump up against each other, and there's a danger that literally we will bump up against each other. And so frictions have occurred. We have the makings of a standoff. Both the United States and China value the same strategic space, with U.S. allies and friends caught in the middle. Quickly, let me evaluate how the United States and China have managed this situation. Looking at China first, I would give it a grade of B. It has worked to increase East Asian economic dependence on China, and that has moderated things. It has built up its military infrastructure in the South China Sea, or infrastructure in Southeast Asia to enhance dependence. East Asian countries are in a bit of a dilemma. Do they depend on China, or do they depend on the United States? Second, China's been generally skillful in how it has sought to use pressure to enhance its own security. It hasn't used force, but it has employed what are called gray zone tactics to advance its position. It assesses what others will be willing to tolerate, and then moves right up to that line. China's been less skillful in employing economic sanctions against its neighbors. Maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A. As for the United States, I would give us a B up to the end of the Obama administration. The Obama administration essentially continued the mainstream traditional strategy of the United States. We did not do such a good job in figuring out how to respond to China's step-by-step expansion of its presence and its influence. I would give the Trump administration a C. It abdicated American leadership on crucial issues like climate change and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The president has taken a narrow view on how to evaluate the contribution of our allies in protecting the common defense and whether trade is both free and fair. There was a lot of reckless talk earlier in the year about a preventive strike against North Korea, and then he flipped, and to the surprise of everyone, said he's going to meet with Kim Jong-un. We'll see if that happens. I personally don't think there was anything fundamentally broken with our policy towards East Asia, and that the changes of the last year have been self-inflicted wounds. So what about options for the future? Here I only have questions. First question, will the United States accommodate to China's desire for a larger security presence in the region, to the point that we, to some extent, abandon our strategy? I certainly hope not. Will Washington conclude that it is in an existential struggle with China on all fronts and respond accordingly? I hope not, because it could be bloody and our allies wouldn't necessarily go along. Will China decide to force our friends and allies to make a choice between China and the United States? Or can we return to the sort of role that we had in East Asia before the arrival of the Trump administration? That's what I hope. I appreciate your attention, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
And now I'd like to ask Jung Pak to come to the podium and make her presentation.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. So I have the pleasure of talking to you about North Korea. I came to Brookings after about almost 9 years at CIA, where I was a political analyst, and I was also at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. I'm working on East Asia issues. And one of the things that Richard said to me when I was trying to make the decision to jump CIA and to go to Brookings, he said, it's going to be so much easier, more flexible time. You can go home early. You won't have to travel as much. But I stand here in front of you and I said, that sounds great, Richard. I'm really happy about that. But I find myself, not working inside the building, which is what I used to do when I worked at the agency, but now I work inside the building, outside the building, in the air, at sea. So thanks, Richard. So last fall when I started, it was really intense. There were the first ever ICBM tests by North Korea. There was the largest nuclear test. We had a new president in the US, and he was engaging in this war of words. And over the period of 4 or 5, 6 months, there seemed to be a steady drumbeat, and we were all marching toward war, whether we're talking about preemptive strikes or preventive strikes on North Korea. But then New Year 2018 comes around, and then Kim Jong-un says, I might want to go to the Olympics. Oh, and also I'm going to mass produce nuclear weapons. And that just upended the apple cart for lots of people. And what we have now is what I call the big scramble. So after Kim Jong-un said he sent out an outreached hand to South Korea jumps. We have the Olympics. We have Kim Jong-un's sister coming down to South Korea for the first time ever. And there she is in flesh and blood, along with the cheerleaders. And then all of a sudden now we have an inter-Korean summit next month, and then a US-North Korea summit the following month. And I use the word scramble for many reasons, because when you say scramble, people are bumping into each other, they're walking around, they're running around trying to figure out what's going on, and that's what's going on right now, I think. When we're talking about maximum pressure on North Korea, it's really easy to get international cooperation, and I think the Trump administration should be credited for harnessing international cooperation on this. But it's relatively easy to get cooperation from the international community on North Korea when it's being really bad. And North Korea was really, really bad last fall and over the winter. North Korea was more diplomatically isolated. We have the strongest sanctions we've ever had. And the international community was united, and we were all coordinated on policy. But with outreach and engagement, it gets much more complicated. We're talking about national priorities coming to the fore or mattering more in terms of applying pressure. There's more coordination to be done. There's more finessing to be done. There's more subtlety and nuance when you're trying to engage. And there are questions about how to engage, what are the deliverables, and what should be the outcomes. And something that I've been focusing on is that we need to have robust coordination with our allies. Let me just point out that North Korea has yet to confirm that it had said all these things about denuclearization, about its willingness to meet with the U.S. president. So even as North Korea has yet to confirm these things, and we have 2 summits all set up, I'm pretty confident that Kim Jong-un is sitting in Pyongyang looking at the drama that's unfolding. President Trump's almost impulsive or reportedly impulsive agreement to this, to a summit, and South Korea taking the lead, Japan and China being publicly supportive but privately pretty nervous about what's going on. And I see a few reasons for why North Korea is not saying anything or confirming or denying. It gives them maximum flexibility on what they can do. They can see what the international community is saying, what the U.S. is going to say, and typically North Korea doesn't actually confirm until there are people coming off the airplane. They're looking to see the big scramble, and they're also not bounding their demands. So if they say we want the troops off the peninsula, that's a non-starter. Summit's off, right? So they're not saying anything because to maximize their flexibility, but also to maximize what the other side might be willing to offer. And finally, I also think that they might be pretty surprised that the president responded so positively. North Korea for decades has been trying to get a meeting with the U.S. president. It gives them legitimacy. So I can't. I think that North Korea is also in a little bit of a scramble themselves, trying to figure out how to maximize the opportunities that fell into their laps. While I support engagement, I think we have to worry about not losing focus on maximum pressure and why we're doing it in the first place. So while Kim was saying we want to engage and we want to improve relations with South Korea during his New Year's speech, let's not forget that he said, I'm also producing mass producing nuclear weapons, and also the U.S. better not mess with us because the nuclear button is in my office. And for Japan, in 2017, Sheila Smith reminded us that of North Korea's 11 successful missile test launches, 5 fell in the 200 nautical miles of Japanese islands. So needless to say, I'm very skeptical about North Korea's alleged offers, and I think there are lots of people in South Korea and in Japan and China who are also, and in the U.S., who are skeptical about North Korea's offers and what might come of those summits. Even if Kim Jong-un did say those things about wanting to improve ties, about talking about, willing to talk about denuclearization, this is not new. This is not. This is an old coming from an old playbook that North Korea has that his father used to use. What's new is that Kim 3.0 is actually saying these things after almost 7 years of saying, I'm never going to give up my nuclear weapons. Here's me with a nuclear warhead. Here's me smoking a cigarette at the missile tests. North Korea is negotiations with North Korea is a long history of disappointment, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and test Kim's willingness to talk. But I fear also that there is an expectation gap. The South Korean Foreign Minister Gang said recently in a TV interview that Kim Jong-un is sincere. The U.S. president said Kim Jong-un is sincere. And Prime Minister Abe is coming to the U.S. next month, probably to say Kim Jong-un is not sincere. Oh, and let's not forget about the abductees. So I think there is an expectation gap among the three, with the U.S. and our allies and our partners, that has to be met. So at a minimum, this is what I would suggest. And in preparation for these summits and these meetings, we have to think about outcomes. How do we bridge those expectations and how to bridge that skepticism? On planning, what do we want out of these meetings? How does the South Korea summit and how's the Inter-Korea summit and the U.S.-North Korea summit, how would they mesh together? How can they be complementary rather than giving North Korea an opportunity to drive a wedge? And that's a classic tactic from the old/now new playbook. And I think as we go through a period of engagement with North Korea, whether it's the South Koreans and the U.S., that it doesn't mean that North Korea, just because it's talking, doesn't mean that it's not planning other things. I can envision North Korea doing a plausibly deniable covert attack on South Korea, whether it's cyber or conventional, to try to test how willing South Korea is willing to go to improve ties, and how much the U.S. will stray from South Korea. So as we're talking, we have to figure out, or in the preparation up to the summits, that we should figure out how we're going to have a coordinated response when North Korea is good and when North Korea is bad. So that we don't have a big scramble when there's a rocket launch, or a big scramble when there's a cyber attack that comes from North Korea, or an artillery exchange between the North and South. So I hope that this big scramble doesn't lead into, or doesn't result in a big scramble of the alliances, because I think the center of gravity in dealing with North Korea issues is the strength of the U.S. relationships with South Korea and Japan, and making sure that China and Russia are still on board on maximum pressure. So I'll stop there and wait for your very good questions, I'm sure. Thanks.
And now it's time for Yuki Tsatsumi.
Good afternoon. Thank you again for the kind invitation. I'm excited to be here this afternoon, especially getting away from a really bad DC weather, which will be worse by the time I fly back tonight. My role is to talk a little bit about Japan, so I would like to do three things. One, I would start off by talking briefly about what kind of a security environment Japan has been facing for the last several years. And then I will touch upon a little bit on how Prime Minister Abe has been trying to respond to those challenges. And I would like to finish off by offering a couple of cautionary note about the constraints within Japan that he's working his external policies. So let me start by talking about the security environment for Japan. As Richard and Jung already quite eloquently laid out, Japan's immediate neighborhood is not exactly safe. And in fact, the security environment that surrounds Japan has been deteriorating for the last several years. Jung already talked about North Korea. Richard talked about China. And by the way, Japan's still technically at war with Russia. And Prime Minister Abe has been spending a lot of time and energy in trying to improve Japan's relationship with Russia and resolving the Northern Territory issues, but nothing is happening on that front either. And in the meantime, Japan's relationship with South Korea has not been great either. So Japan really doesn't have a very good friend in its neighborhood. So how does Prime Minister Abe cope with this? Externally, point number one, hug America tighter. Prime Minister Abe never really had a great personal chemistry with President Obama. But closely aligning, and because it did align with what he considered as Japan's national interest, a lot of his policy choices end up being very, very closely aligned with that of the United States. And then especially after he made a big political commitment to push the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I think he did gain President Obama's confidence. So they were never best buddies, but I think they had a very close working relationship. And I think they considered each other as a very reliable partner to do business with and work with. And I will steer clear from the economy and trade because I will hear definitely more about that in a second panel. But what he really put an effort in was to ride out the presidential transition here last year. As many of you may have seen in the media, Prime Minister Abe flew to New York only about a couple of weeks after President Trump was elected, had a personal meeting. President Trump is inaugurated in January 2017. he heads into the summit meeting with him in February, spend a whole day on the golf course with him. And oh, by the way, that was during that time that the North Korea fired another missile. So they had this great picture where two leaders on the golf course or somewhere in the vicinity on the Trump real estate standing side by side, where Japanese Prime Minister was the main speaker in that joint press conference. And another way for Prime Minister Abe to cope with, respond to these security challenges that Japan faces in its immediate neighborhood is to reach out to other US allies and security partners right outside, basically beyond the immediate East Asia. He has been investing bilaterally a lot of time in enhancing bilateral relationship with Australia and India, Philippines and Vietnam, all the key countries that Richard pointed out in the slide in his presentation. And especially since the inauguration of the Trump administration, he is working very closely with Australia and India to make sure that this administration stays engaged in this region. So trilateral dialogue is happening a lot more often. They actually are having the reemergence of what we call Quad, which is US, Japan, India, Australia security partnership talk. We call it Quad 2.0 because it happened about 10 years ago, was the version 1.0, and it really didn't go anywhere. But this time 2.0, jury is still out, how this Quad 2.0. But even outside of the what we now call Indo-Pacific region, Prime Minister Abe also spends a lot of time in enhancing relationship with major NATO allies and also in Africa. So you might call him as a diplomat-in-chief in Japan. You actually hear and read more about the foreign trips that he takes or foreign visitor that visited to come and see him rather than the foreign minister, which is actually quite unusual. And internally, Abe has been, one of the big priority for Prime Minister Abe is to streamline government's decision-making process. So he empowered the National Security Secretariat big time, and actually is now a functioning organization that actually facilitates interagency coordination much, much better than any of us has seen in the past. And he also legislated a couple of the very important defense reform, which I'm happy to talk about it in Q&A, but this gets really, really granular, so I'll leave that off for now for the interest in time. And with the security challenges that Richard and Jung talked about, and his ongoing external effort, this year, 2018, is actually a quite important year for Japan's defense policy. Japanese government have two types of midterm. By midterm, I mean a 4 to 5 year planning for a policy planning guideline and as well as acquisition guideline. And both of those documents are being revised. Big challenge on that is a balance. Since Prime Minister Abe came into the office, many of you probably have started reading about how Japan starts to increase its defense budget. But at the end of the day, Japan's defense budget is 1/10 of ours. So with that limitation, there are limited, finite choices that Japan can make and a trade-off that it needs to make. But Abe probably will not be able to do some of his more ambitious agenda that he was hoping to achieve. One of them, which you often read about, is constitutional reform. But that is probably not happening. That is my prediction, but I can be proved wrong. But he's actually quite constrained domestically at this point. Why? He is more politically constrained than is actually believed or appears outside. One of the reasons is the political reality in Japan, that Prime Minister Abe seems very, very stable, right? I mean, we have all this turmoil, change of government everywhere, and he's there. But he's there not because of his own popularity, but everybody else's unpopularity. So but what do I mean by that is that his support is actually not that deep. So anything primarily in the economic realm, the voter is not happy, the tide can very, very quickly turn. And we're actually seeing that happening within Japan right now at this moment in the last week or so. And with all the, again, this is a more suitable topic for a second panel, but many of the economic and social policy initiatives that he came out with, like Abenomics we all heard about, or Society That Women Can Shine that we all heard about. Those were articulated quite eloquently when he initially launched it, but after 5 years in the office, it really hasn't been translated into something that's tangible that the voters can feel. So a lot of the voters probably are feeling, when do I see these results of all these what's supposed to be a great initiatives? He talks about, working moms should be able to work, go back to work after the child. Well, there's still a long, long waiting list on child care centers. And that has not been improved all that much. So there are some of those things that he talked about it, but then result is very much lagging. And when it comes to constitutional reform, the metaphor that I like to use is about 17 years ago, his predecessor named Junichiro Koizumi, who was popular. I mean, his popularity at one point was like 80%. And he did not touch the Constitution. And many people would like to say, well, he had other priorities, and he did. He wanted to open up the economy, he preferred the deregulation, but he also, my perspective is that he also picked fight. And he chose not to touch Constitution. So if a prime minister with 80% popularity will not touch the Constitution, prime minister with average of 40% of approval rating at any given moment, or between the 40 to 50, he would not be able to pull it off. And my view is, if Koizumi couldn't do it, it's probably not until his son, who's now a growing, bright, rising political star, comes to senior enough position that we will probably not be able to, we would probably not see this issue seriously debated with a real reality of constitutional reform coming. So let me end at that, and I would like to look for your comments on the questions. Thank you.
So much food for thought, and now we're going to turn the stage over to our two discussants who are going to respond, provoke, denounce. I'm not sure what they have cooked up. But anyway, Katrine Katz is going to speak first. And do you want to come up, or do you just want to stay there?
Can you, going up is better?
Yeah, okay, why don't you come on up here?
Sure. Well, thank you for those very thought-provoking and really thorough presentations covering a broad span of the region, both long-term trends and kind of very immediate issues that the region and indeed Japan is facing. I'd like to just start out by saying this is a bit of a crossing of worlds for me. I'm a proud Northwestern PhD graduate from last December, but I actually came from the policy world. So it's quite a happy moment to be crossing these worlds, and also shows, I think, the very important kind of synergies that can be found in combining academic and policy work. On that note, this is a region that I have tracked and studied and had a great passion for a long time. And one of the things that I think comes out of these presentations that has been, is a challenge for any regional watcher, is where to focus the eye on. Long-term trends, short-term trends. This is something that I think I resonate with Jung's comment about how much work it is to actually follow the daily news. I've actually jumped back into that space myself in recent months since graduating, and I don't know which is more work. I think it's both a lot of work, and I think it's really important work on both ends. But as you can see, in order to really understand what's going on in this region and to come up with solutions for the present day, you need both, right? And so you need collaborations across these spaces and across these countries. So I think the expertise that we have on this panel kind of drew out some of these themes. Richard very helpfully started out with, I think, a broad span overview of kind of the strategic interests coming from China's perspective in the region and really mapping out what the strategic order has looked at like over the long term. My one question for you would be, how do you think China is going to respond to this more near-term issue with this surprise kind of summit development? Both Jung and Yuki then brought up kind of more near-term trends and brought up a number of really interesting issues that I hope will come out in the Q&A. My question for you both really has to do with this very important issue of alliance management. One of the things I think that helps in looking at the region is paying close attention to bilaterals, right? What's going on in one bilateral will affect what's going on in other bilaterals. So really you need to focus your eye on all these things at once. And so one of the troubling things that's happened recently, from my perspective, is to see Japan and South Korea having some hard times. Of course, this is part of cyclical cycles of contention that we've seen in this relationship for a long time. So when it comes, from the perspective of the United States, in terms of trying to manage kind of stability in the region, if indeed that is our aim over the longer term, if we are to coordinate the alliances in this present moment around the current North Korea threat, what are some of the challenges and opportunities we might see there? And I'll leave it at that and look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Now, last but not least, Daniel Kirkmark.
All right, thank you for having me here. I am the lone non-East Asian specialist on this panel. I come from a background of international relations more broadly and international security in particular. So I'm going to ask 3 questions to the panel that might reveal a little bit of my ignorance on some of the issues, but I think this might capture how those of us who take a non-detailed East Asian view come at this subject. So first is mostly for Richard. I heard a lot of terms like the US and China might bump up, experience friction, and even experience a standoff. I did not hear the word war mentioned in your talk. But this is ultimately, I think, the big concern that most scholars and the public worry about. Will this power transition be like virtually every other power transition that we've seen, where we've seen major military conflict between the second power and the first power around the time of transition? I think there are a couple reasons for optimism here, right? So this will be the first major power transition featuring a very, very high level of economic interdependence, and also 2 states that both have nuclear weapons. So is this a cause for optimism? Will the US-China power transition be different than previous power transitions? My second question is mostly for Jung, although anyone could offer their thoughts. And I'd like to know, what do you think, or what's the inside the Beltway thinking at least, on what is the best outcome that the US could realistically get with regards to North Korea? So complete denuclearization sounds great, but I also think that's probably a pipe dream. Or am I wrong about that? My sense is that nuclear weapons are not only an important source of domestic legitimacy for Kim Jong-un, but also the regime's ultimate life preserver. Right, so I'd imagine that Kim Jong-un's very worried that if he were to cut some deal with the West to give up his nuclear weapons in exchange for better relations, that he could end up being the next Muammar Gaddafi. So what could we realistically hope to get in terms of our bilateral relationship with North Korea? And then lastly, this is for everybody. To what extent is the current situation in East Asia driven by kind of broad structural factors? And to what extent is it driven by the personalities of the individual leaders? So typically when we talk about foreign policy, we would say the US thinks this, China thinks that, North Korea thinks that. But in this situation, we talk so much about Donald Trump said this, Xi Jinping did that. We think that Kim Jong-un thinks this. So to what extent is it just the individual personalities at the top that are driving the current situation, or is this kind of broader than the individual leaders that we have in power right now. I know there are a lot of other people that want questions, so I will stop there. Thank you.
So now what I'd like to do is give the panelists, the first three speakers, a chance to respond if they wish to the two sets of comments. And you don't have to travel anymore. You can just stay where you are. And then once you've had a chance, we'll open things up for general conversation. So, Richard, do you want to?
Thank you very much. Thank you both for your questions. Concerning the first one, what has been China's response to the announcement of the Kim-Trump meeting? There has been a rhetorical welcome of this, and because China does not want to see the Korea conflict descend into war, anything that moves the United States and North Korea away from that brink is a good thing. And China has offered some ideas about how to stabilize this situation short of total denuclearization. And that could be one way that it works out, although I doubt it. I even have doubts whether the meeting's going to take place, but that's another story. On the other hand, I suspect that there is some anxiety in Beijing that they could lose control over the dynamic on this conflict. China has wanted to be at the center of this for the last 15 years. And what you might say is happening is that Kim Jong-un is doing an end run around China and dealing too much with the United States. So I think China's ambivalent, but I expect it'll find a way through this. The question about war and power transition, this really is the big question. I'm not sure that the pattern that some scholars have set forth, that a rising power always leads to war, is actually true. I'm not sure that it's just because the new power was rising that you had war. In this case, I think that there are certain things arguing for an avoidance of war. It is true that there is economic interdependence between China and the United States, but it may be that the economic interdependence is actually declining. Number one, because China is becoming more mercantilist, and number two, because the United States or the Trump administration has an inkling to engage in a trade war with China. Nuclear weapons certainly are stabilizing, and that has led to what some people call the long peace in East Asia. If there is conflict erupting in East Asia, it would be through miscalculation or the escalation of a situation that nobody expected. One can hypothesize that happening over Taiwan, particularly if there were certain domestic developments within Taiwan. It seems to be possible on the Korean Peninsula where North Korea engages in some kind of military action and South Korea were to retaliate, and then North Korea retaliates, and then the whole thing spins out of control. There could be frictions in the South China Sea that lead to results that we wouldn't want. Fortunately, both countries are conscious of this problem and have done some work in developing fire breaks against that. I do think that this dynamic in East Asia is led by structural factors. One is the sort of heft of China as a large economy with certain security imperatives, such as I described in my talk. I think that there is a historical motivation here. China is probably the only case of a rising power that once was the dominant power of its region. And so it's actually inappropriate to talk about China's rise. This is more China's revival. And any politically conscious Chinese today remembers that China was a great power at one time and feels a sense of sort of responsibility to help make China great again. Individuals matter, and they can be vessels for the operation of these structural factors, and they can also sort of create certain, or they can move things in one direction or another by virtue of their own choices and their own agency. And so, it does matter that Donald Trump is our president and not Hillary Clinton. But how that's going to work out, I don't know. I think there are people in the U.S. government, people in the Chinese government who want to bound this problem and minimize the negative impact of both structural and personality factors. Thank you.
Thanks for your excellent questions, both of you. On the alliance management issue, so I mean, when President Moon came to power last May, and he was clobbered all over, over the head when he came to the U.S. and met with the president, and there was all this talk about how they didn't get along versus Abe and Trump, being buddies. There was the dominant narrative in South Korea was Korea passing, and now with the summit and with President Moon, in the driver's seat on peninsula issues, it's the idea of Japan passing, and I think it's unfortunate that it has to be either or. And that the two sides would see it as, if South Korea is doing this, then we must be being sidelined, or if Japan is doing this, then South Korea must be sidelined. So, and I know that the Obama administration did a lot more legwork, rolled up their sleeves and tried to get both Tokyo and Seoul to work better with each other. Leading to, helping in some ways to get the 2015's the so-called Comfort Woman deal and a modest military intelligence agreement. But, I think alliance management is hard, and you've done it, Katrin, and, my colleagues have done it, Richard has done it. So it's hard, it's dirty, it's messy, and it goes to personalities too, right? And in East Asia, we have this constellation of actors with, very nationalist leanings, and they're not shy about advancing and promoting their nationalist objectives. So. So I wish that we could. I was heartened by the fact that our NSA met with his counterparts from South Korea and Japan last week or earlier this week in San Francisco to talk about some of the outcomes for the summit and to make sure that they're not going to be throwing each other under the bus. On what's the inside the Beltway thinking about the best outcome? Because personality matters so much in the White House, I don't know if it matters, right? What the inside the Beltway thinking is. I think conventional wisdom would say, a presidential summit comes after a lot of legwork, and the diplomats have done their work, and the National Security Council staff have done their work. But this president is clearly willing to throw it out there and then let the others and let policy catch up with him. So I think from my perspective, I don't think denuclearization is likely. You're right. Given the iconography of that the North Koreans have been advancing in terms of Kim being so closely and personally identified with the nuclear weapons program, I don't think he's willing to give it up. But I think what's more likely is that there's a claimed breakthrough. That what happens is not new, not that great, but then both sides or all sides touted as a breakthrough in U.S.-North Korea ties, whether it's on long-range missiles, whether it's on, I don't know, or that Kim and Trump establish a rapport, and that Kim actually is serious about denuclearization this time. The other side too is that if that talks just get dragged out over years, months, and which only strengthens North Korea's leverage, as that will probably tend to weaken the maximum pressure and sanctions implementation, especially by China. And to say that we have to create conditions for better ties with North Korea, so let's look the other way when that ship is refueling in the middle of the ocean. So I think. So those are more likely than denuclearization, but denuclearization is just so out there that I just don't think it's going to happen. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you for interesting questions. On alliance management, I very much agree with Jung. It really shouldn't be either or, like a zero-sum, like Japan up and South Korea down and vice versa. But historically, this particular set of alliances are doing this zero-sum ups and downs, like you said, almost cyclically and endlessly. And you would think that when North Korea was behaving really, really bad, that would have been the time that would have been a great time for this zero-sum trade-off, being halted, but it didn't. So now that North Korea is not as bad, I would expect those inter-allies competition for Washington's attention probably is going to get worse, which is unfortunate because that's really not the way that should be handled. I mean, we have, like Jung said, we have a bigger fish to catch, which is to make sure that North Korea to keep an eye on what North Korea is up to. Does this current situation or developments in East Asia personality-driven or more of a reflection of a bigger trend? I would say there are certain broader trends that are not confined to this region. So multipolarization is one. Also, broader distribution of knowledge is another. In fact, for those of us who looks at U.S. defense policy and defense technologies, we often talk about how those most cutting edge technology now lives outside Pentagon. It's all private sector driven now. And key for us is to how to harness that over this very, very old archaic acquisition process and security regulations and all that. And then I think there is really this broader question that current international order, which is built upon certain fundamental principles, but that's post 1945. It did stand the test of end of the Cold War, but I think with the revival of China and other emergence of powers who were not the active participant of creating this current order, I think there is a question that can this current international order stand the test of time this time around? And there is that big trend out there, certainly in East Asia, that's going on. But I think a personality really enhances that trend, particularly in East Asia. So I'll leave it at that.
Can I just add one more thing about alliances? A lot of the anxiety, I think, comes from the political levels. But when it comes to intelligence and when it comes to military, hands down, everybody tells me that it's great. We still work really well with our counterparts. There's no daylight with so the alliance infrastructure is resilient and strong, although you might see some cracks on the political levels. But I think the system, the alliance system as a whole, is pretty healthy.
So I'm going to commend all of our panelists for staying close to time. We are really right on track here, and so there's a good chunk of time now for questions from the audience. So I will just indicate, and if you could stand and speak in a loud voice so we can all hear. This gentleman here.
I thought I'd be first because you're following up on the word alliance. I have a sore throat. So. Following up on the word alliance. A scenario, however many years from now, both South Korea and Japan will face a choice, and that choice will be either to move to the China orbit or to stay with the alliance. And I'm not sketching here a scenario in which these two entities are under duress, but there are benefits and there are disadvantages of staying in the American orbit. I'm interested to know what you can tell us about the public mood in Japan and the public mood in South Korea regarding the alliance, regarding the presence regarding the American presence there, and whether you see that given the proper incentives that if the mood is now to stay or to remain, could that mood change? So what is the course of public mood as you see moving forward?
So I think the public mood in South Korea, the support for the public support for the alliance is strong, less so for the U.S. president, although there's a little blip, or there's a cohort in the South Korean polled population, like 20-something males who like the president or favor the U.S. president. So the public mood is it's overwhelmingly in support of the alliance, but as with there is a strain of anti-American Americanism within South Korea that could rear its ugly head as soon as some incident happens, right? So as in or some trade issue, but so far I think we're in a pretty stable and pretty good position in terms of the public mood, the public support for the U.S. alliance.
I think I would say the very similar thing in Japan. Like a public in South Korea, I think Japanese public also differentiates U.S. and this current president. So this current president is not necessarily popular, although when he was in Japan with Mrs. Trump, or when his daughter was in Tokyo for some big conference, there were all these women following them, these two ladies around. So they do differentiate this president and his wife and his daughter, but that's another matter with the general support for the alliance with the United States. The U.S.-Japan alliance has been getting constantly close to a 75-80% approval rating. It's when it comes to China, especially now with this recent change in China that looks like President Xi could rule for life. Mood in Japan is, would we ever go into China's orbit? Hell no. We would not go there. We like democracy. So
China's done it. Richard mentioned that China's been clumsy. The fact that they had this, unofficial economic retaliation for the deployment of the THAAD in South Korea, and that there were like $6 or $7 billion worth of losses by South Korean companies. That did not help matters very much with the South Korean public. So I think that China's not doing itself any favors by clobbering South Korea over what they think is with decisions that they don't agree with.
I agree with that. That was a point I was going to make. But I would also say that it also matters a lot what we do. First of all, do we address the sort of domestic policy areas where we've allowed the pillars of our national power to weaken over the last 20 or 30 years. And do we have both the will and the capabilities to continue to play the American leadership role that we played after World War II? Both Japanese and Koreans watch like hawks at to determine how much they can count on the United States. That in turn sort of affects their calculation. If I had to make a wild bet, I would say it's more likely that South Korea at some point would decide that the smartest thing is to accommodate to China. China could help itself on that regard. Less likely that Japan would.
I think we had a question here. Yeah.
Thank you, panelists, for your presentation. I have two questions. So first, I'm really interested with Richard's metaphors of Xi Jinping as Superman. And my question is, when he looks from above and looks to the south, interestingly, you jump over to Australia. From Philippines, you jump over to Australia. So can you explain a bit about the role of Southeast Asian countries in ASEAN in that matter? And second question is, with the coming of the new State Secretary, Mike Pompeo, should we expect something different, especially with South Korea, for example, because U.S. hasn't found ambassador for South Korea this far? Should we expect something from the new State Secretary? Oh, and last thing, if Xi Jinping is a Superman, what is his kryptonite? What is his what deters him to move forward against the others? Because we know that the Lex Luthor or the U.S. is, quite careless about the region now. Thank you.
Okay, on the last question, there are two types of kryptonite at work here. One is the corruption of the Chinese system, which he's done a lot to attack. And it was something that some Chinese leader had to do, and he's been more successful. But it's still a problem. Second, I think that creating more uncertainty about the succession to himself will turn out to be a huge error, because it will make more intense the competition to succeed him whenever that happens. It's said that succession is the biggest problem in an authoritarian regime. You're right to raise Southeast Asia. I was just looking at countries in East Asia that have special relationship with the United States, and of course it varies from country to country. It varies with a single country over time. The Philippines under Benigno Aquino was quite different from the Philippines under President Duterte, and that worked to China's advantage. Singapore is closer to the United States than Indonesia, but Indonesia also understands the need to calibrate its relationships carefully. It doesn't hurt the United States when China behaves in a heavy-handed way, because it tends to drive them into our arms. But we have to be skillful ourselves in order not to drive our friends into China's arms and make them think that they do have to make a choice between China and the United States, and China is close and the United States is far away. As far as Secretary-designate Pompeo, I have no idea. I think he'll be at least a different personality than Rex Tillerson. I hope that he realizes that rebuilding the institution of the Department of State will make him a more successful secretary than leaving the sort of deterioration in capacity that that Rex Tillerson at least accommodated to.
Actually, let me add a few things on Southeast Asia. So, in my initial remarks, I talked a little bit about Quad 2.0, and one of the reasons why that the Quad version 1 wasn't successful was China. Not because of China, but then Japan, India, Australia, and United States had a very different view on where China was at that time and where China would go. At that point, I think even in the United States, there were still a lot of people who still believed that China would be a responsible major power, and it would not be behaving in the way that it has been now. So now the Quad version 2 is working out, seems to be a little bit better for the outset now, is because I think these 4 countries start to see China in a very similar light. That they all see China as it's very disruptive to the international order, that they themselves built around their economy, and they themselves built around their diplomacy relationship with other states. And they, all these 4 countries looks at Southeast Asia with particular concern, because this is where what national security strategy and defense strategy described as a predatory economic practice is really at the forefront. And the Southeast Asia and South Asia, and we start seeing a little bit of that in Africa now. And they really, particularly Japan, really feels that it is important to maintain ties with the countries that has been going some testing time with United States. So, for example, Philippines, President Duterte has a very unique personality, as we all know. And until President Trump came along, President Obama really did not care for him. But if anything about Prime Minister Abe, he has this really natural talent of getting along with very difficult personalities. So President Trump is number 1. President Putin is the other. President Duterte is the other one. So he managed to kind of keep an open communication line with him, so that, yes, it's not currently helping the United States in the South China Sea decision and all that, but at least it's still talking to our side. And same thing with Thailand. Since the military coup d'etat, like our ties with Thailand has been a little bit strained, but then Japan still has a pretty steady relationship with Thailand. Indonesia is the same story. Vietnam, Myanmar was one of the very few issues that Japan was not hesitant to defer with the United States, from when in the United States we were calling the country Burma. So Southeast Asia, very strategically important as far as Japan is concerned, and I think now more so for the Japan's other security partners.
There was a question over here. There, you got a mic. Yep.
Yes, hello, Lyric Hughes-Hale with EconView. Very pleased to be here. Wonderful panel. Thank you. My question is about if the DPRK has been temporarily at least defanged through, no matter what you think of President Trump, very innovative diplomacy. Are we really in a false spring right now? And are we headed towards other issues, particularly Taiwan? I think Xi Jinping, there's no doubt that his legacy issue is going to be to reunify with Taiwan one way or the other. And now we have this Friday coming trade sanctions that are going to be pretty severe that will be announced, $60 billion worth at least. So are we headed on a collision course in spite of this temporary thaw? Are we still headed on a collision course? And what do you think of Taiwan's position? Are they the odd man out? Thank you.
Thanks for your question. On the DPRK, I think that there is a good chance that we are in a false spring, and let me just give you one reason why I think that. You hear sort of thrown around the phrase denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And the United States and North Korea have very different definitions of what that means. For the United States, it means the denuclearization of North Korea. For North Korea, it means removal of the nuclear threat and the threat from the United States. So you ask them what it means, they'll say, oh, it means the end of the U.S. ROK alliance. It means the withdrawal of U.S. troops from the peninsula. It means the end of the nuclear umbrella, all of which are non-starters for the United States. And so if there's going to be a real spring instead of a false spring, smart people are going to have to get over those gaps in how we define the problem. With respect to Taiwan, you ask a good question. Xi Jinping, I am sure, would like to solve, quote unquote, the Taiwan issue on his watch. He has framed it in such a way rhetorically that if that goal was achieved by 2049, that would be okay. There's a stalemate in relations between China and Taiwan right now for some complicated reasons, but it has mainly to do with who is in power in Taiwan and how China interprets the goals of the Democratic Progressive Party and President Tsai. Whether they're correct or not in their assessment of what those goals are is another question. It appears that Xi Jinping is willing to wait out this government in Taiwan and be unwilling to deal with it and hope that something better comes along, in the knowledge that in the intervening period between now and 2020 or 2024, China will only be stronger, Taiwan will only be weaker, at least in relative terms, and perhaps the people in Taiwan will realize that they have no other choice than to make their peace with China. I think that Beijing is underestimating the desire of people in Taiwan to preserve their democratic system and not be sort of cowed into submitting, and that's something that China has had to learn over and over and over again. Thanks.
Anyone else from the panel? Are you guys? I think this gentleman who voted, the man voted today, so good for him, and he gets to ask a question right here. Thank you.
The topic of this panel is Japan, United States, and future of Asia. I want to go back to, for decades, if we had officials from the United States or Japan getting together, they all referred back to Ambassador Mike Mansfield's proclamation that the U.S.-Japan bilateral relationship was the most important, bar none. Mm-hmm. Is that still true today?
Very interesting question.
Move the mic a little bit closer.
Okay. Very interesting question. I would very much like to say yes, but from Japanese perspective, that's still absolutely true today, as well as several decades ago when Senator Mansfield said that. From U.S. perspectives, however, this is a persistent gap between the United States and Japan. For Japan, United States is their only ally. So of course, the relationship with the United States is the most important relationship in the world, bar none. When you're sitting in Washington, though, you have other allies too. That has the same kind of defense commitment, very similar security commitment. So depending on what's happening in short term, yes, long term, Japan is not, Japan will, I don't, for the foreseeable future, I don't see a scenario where this country considers Japan as an unimportant partner. I won't see that. But will it be the most important bilateral relationship, bar none? Maybe not always so from the American perspective. And that actually has been, even when Senator Mansfield said that, that was the gap that was there. When he said it while he was an ambassador to Japan, that really fostered a lot of goodwill, a positive feeling toward toward this bilateral relationship. And it was actually, given the time that he said it, I think it was quite appropriate because Japan was just coming out of this. Coming out of this decades of the turmoil on like student movement and anti-war movement, and there were a couple of quite high media attention incident by U.S. forces where actually Japanese civilian died, and so it was appropriate for him to say that, to kind of turn the atmosphere to the positive way. But I think from the U.S. side, I think there is that reality that we have allies all over the world. Japan is important, but it is one of the important allies.
If I could just
yeah,
make a
please, go
quick
ahead.
comment. I mean, there's a difference between the most important bilateral alliance relationship and the most important bilateral relationship. I would say that during the Cold War, the most important bilateral relationship for the United States was with the Soviet Union. Not because we got along with them, but they could destroy us many times over. So you got to get the management of that relationship right. I would say that for the future, the most important bilateral relationship is probably with China, because one can imagine ways where mismanagement of that relationship could lead to war.
I think we have time for one last question, and Bill, you get to ask it, but only if it's a brief one. All right, there we go.
Okay, I'll try to be very, very brief. I would love to ask a question about Southeast Asia, but I think that opens up things beyond the scope of this panel, actually, which is really about Japan, Korea, and United States. So I'll ask a question about alliance management, but from a slightly different angle, which is that I find it interesting that a lot of people looking from the outside perceive China as increasingly secure and increasingly confident. I don't think anything could be further from the truth. China, in fact, is facing a number of constraints, in fact, near crises domestically, which are manifested in things like Xi Jinping's move to amend the constitution and in some of China's external policies. So given the great constraints and domestic concerns that China faces, as well as a sort of ideational difference between China and a lot of other great powers over this issue of sort of unipolarity or bipolarity versus multipolarity. And I think China needs to be taken at face value when they say they want a multipolar world, not a bipolar world. The agenda that China has is fundamentally different. And the constraints and calculations that it's facing are fundamentally different from what I think the United States often assumes. The U.S. frequently just doesn't engage with China. When it does, it assumes that China is going to behave more or less as the U.S. would in an equivalent position, which I don't think is true. So I think the U.S. basically doesn't get this. I don't think the Japanese foreign policy establishment gets this as a community, and those who do, I think, face even more significant constraints domestically, institutionally and politically, from saying so or advocating for a different kind of policy towards China. That leaves South Korea to sort of manage the two alliances, both with Japan and with the U.S. So my big question is, what can South Korea do to convince the U.S. and Japan to take a more creative tack, not necessarily more accommodating by any means, but more creative tack in their strategy vis-a-vis policy with China?
You've stunned the panelists, so.
First of all, I would say that there is at least some appreciation for the problems that China faces and how that could affect its external behavior. I would, in terms of the resources for dealing with these problems, I would rather be Xi Jinping than Donald Trump, because we face a bunch of domestic problems ourselves, and we haven't figured out how to solve the resource problem in a way that's politically acceptable to all parties concerned. I think it's also true that even if you have domestic problems, well, let me back up and say, I think the thrust of my presentation was to acknowledge that China believes it's in a security dilemma with the United States, and that we need to take that into account and not jump to the conclusion that it's a revisionist power. I think it's also true that leaders in all countries, they often find that foreign policy and national security are easier to do than addressing domestic problems. Xi Jinping is probably in that position. Barack Obama was in that position. George W. Bush was in that position, and so on and so on and so on. So, I think Xi Jinping is going to do two things at one time: deal with the domestic stuff, which he understands, but also improve China's strategic situation externally.
So one of the things that frustrate, and I think Katrin could probably speak more about this. One of the things that's frustrating for the inside the Beltway crowd is the whole, Japan and South Korea should be the best of friends. They're similar economic powerhouses. They're in the neighborhood. They face similar threats. But this history issue keeps nagging at them, and the territorial issue with the, if you remember, the Moon administration served Dokdo shrimp, when President Trump went to visit. And so, they keep on talking about the history issue over the security issues that probably should be more paramount. But I don't know, Katrin, if you wanted to talk more about that.
Yeah, I have, I guess since we're getting near the end of the time, I have kind of an overarching comment that, if I may, as a discussant, touches on a number of these things. Getting back to Dan's, I think, a really good question about the impact of personalities versus structure. And I'm sorry if this seems like a segue. I'll get back to the alliance point in a minute. I think over the broad sweep of the post-World War II era, I think it was safe to say personalities kind of came in and out, and we saw more kind of stability over time, at least in terms of like this question of war and other things. But I would like to kind of raise three areas of, I think, important uncertainty that do stem from the personality of our current leadership here in the United States that we don't have the answers to yet, but just maybe to pose questions. And I'll just take a couple words that we've used on the panel. One is the issue of war. I know in my time working on Korea issues, the region, we haven't seen so much talk about the possibility of war. It was at one point kind of this thing out there with North Korea, but just pretty much we thought, well, maybe they might strike first, and it would be somewhat unthinkable, suicidal for the North Korean regime to do such a thing. Well, now, in fact, we're talking about a U.S. side of a military strike, and that's different. That puts a lot of unpredictability into the mix. A second area, Jung mentioned the word legwork on the part of foreign policy expert community within Washington, of course, more broadly across the United States. We now wonder whether that matters, right? Is it going to matter when, if it happens, President Trump sits across the table from the North Korean leader? Does that matter? That perhaps yes, but we don't know, and that's something that a question we haven't had before. Thirdly, and yes, Jung mentioned, I definitely have followed the ups and downs of Japan-South Korea as well as Japan-China over time. And I think the reassuring thing about studying it is the kind of inherent stability in the iteration, right? We're very used to de-escalation in the region and, maybe even became complacent in thinking things will eventually de-escalate. But there is some uncertainty now added to the mix in terms of if the U.S. is indeed kind of valuing unpredictability to create leverage, which of course it might work, right? What does that do to the alliances? That's a really new thing for the alliances to inject into the picture. That's pretty dangerous in my view, but I hope I'm wrong. And maybe, these are questions, not answers. And so what follows from these things is just this broader question of, what's changed and what's the same. And we're left with that open-ended question, but I do think these are potentially important changes with a broader long-term, potential impact. Will the order sustain the present moment? And we, of course, hope so. At least I do. But I'll leave with that. Thanks.
So many questions, and we'll have to stop there. We're going to have a 10-minute break before our next panel, but please join me in thanking both the presenters and the discussants for a really stimulating conversation.